Yo, what's poppin' guys? Sizzle here, and today I'm going to be giving you a top 500 OpenQ players perspective of the Season 1 tier list in OpenQ for Overwatch 2. So first off, we have Diva, one of the most essential picks in OpenQ, easily a high S tier. Hog is the most prevalent character in all of OpenQ, I'm just going to give that out there now. And Diva is one of the best answers to Hog because she can just constantly defense matrix anything around Hog, so he loses a lot of that value, and then the team, your team's Hog can get a lot more value. She also is a decent dive tank and can easily destroy a lot of the healers in the game. And in OpenQ, you're pretty much always running either 3 tanks, 2 healers, or 4 tanks, 1 healer. And in either of those comps, Diva can just kind of roll the healers, and if the healers die, your team basically wins every fight, because having healing versus having no healing is a big difference in OpenQ. Then next up, we have Zenyatta, who I'd say is a solid B tier pick. Kind of depends on your team. If your team is good, if you have a lot of coordination, if you're like a 5-stack or something, Zenyatta can do some absolute work with his Discord orbs. If you call your Discord orbs and you have a bunch of dive tanks, just dive that target, you can actually just completely roll teams. But if there's not a lot of coordination on your team, or your team isn't playing all that well, Zenyatta is extremely squishy, and with the amount of dive tanks running around in OpenQ, he will die every like 3 seconds. One of the most valuable targets to pick in a fight as well, so it makes him even more of a target. Basically, it's entirely dependent on how well your team is playing, or how well the enemy team's playing, but he can be a carry pick in a lot of scenarios, but also a throw pick if you're up against like a good team. Next up, we have Bastion, and honestly, I'd say he's a B tier pick as well. He has a lot of damage, which can be nice depending on the tanks you're running into. I've seen a lot of comps of stuff like Winston, Orisa, and then you pretty much always have a Hog as a third. And if it's that specific comp, he kind of rolls pretty hard there, because there's not much you can do to stop the damage he has coming through. But that being said, he is still a DPS character, so he has less health. Even if his damage output is a little bit higher than the average tank, the loss of that health makes him a lot more vulnerable to Roadhog, so if your team is not protecting your Bastion in the same way they'd be protecting a Zenyatta, you lose almost all of that value, and he actually kind of becomes a throw pick, kind of like Zen. So he's basically in the same scenario, but worse off as a character, because Zen has the heal and the damage output, and Bastion is specifically just the damage. Next up, we have Winston, and I'd say he's a solid A tier character. Like I said, you're almost always running 3 tanks, 2 supports, or 4 tanks, 1 support. If you're in that 4 tank, 1 support category, depending on what your support is and how well they're playing, Winston gets basically no value. Against 2 healers, Winston's almost always a somewhat decent pick at least, and can be really good depending on your communication and how well your teamwork is. But in the average OpenQ solo queue lobby, Winston is not that great of a pick, but still a very decent one that you definitely can't go too wrong with as long as your Winston is playing well and making sure they're diving pretty much only the healers, because you don't get a lot of value diving into 3 tanks on Winston. Next up, we have McCree or Cassidy, whatever you want to call him, and I'd say he's a solid D tier pick. He doesn't have enough damage to kill tanks fast, and that's really important when you're fighting like 4 or 3 tanks at a time. So he basically just doesn't do enough and is still really squishy. He's definitely one of the better DPS to have because he can play at some level of range, and he can somewhat pick the squishies in the backline every now and then. But on average, I mean, you get no value, and even just generally, like you don't get a lot of value from a McCree or Cassidy on your team in OpenQ. Then next up we have Sigma. And you know what, before I get into him, I'm gonna add another tier for the, I'm just gonna call this the SS tier, because it's like stuff that's essential, right? Diva's like an essentially good pick. Sigma, I'd say, is just a really good pick. He's a solid S tier character. Having a shield is really nice, but the main thing he has going for him is that left shift. It's just another answer to the damage that's output by stuff like Bastion or Roadhog or even Diva herself. The shield helps protect people as well, and double shield can be really useful, especially when you're running stuff like a Bastion. His damage output is also pretty high, and the stun from his rock and just the sheer size of it makes it really easy to hit onto tanks and cancel some really core abilities like hook, like, you know, stunning someone out of like defense matrix, out of like one of their ults or something. It's an absurdly good set of abilities, gets him a lot of utility in open queue. The main downside, of course, is he has very low mobility and a very low movement speed, which kind of can be a problem if your team is running like a dive comp and you're just kind of out of position. But if you play a more defensive open queue type of comp, then he gets a lot of value and can be a very solid pick on your team. Then we have Widowmaker, and I'd say she's a C tier. Unlike McCree, she has that one-shot potential for supports. So if you're running against double support specifically, if you're running against one support, Widow is almost always going to be a throw pick, no matter how good you are with her. Unless it's something like King's Row First or something, where you can kind of go uncontested and headshot a bunch of people. But unless you're really good at Widow, she's almost always a throw pick in open queue. You can only really kill the supports in the backline. And because you're now a Widowmaker instead of a tank or something like Bastion, where they kind of have to like divert a lot of their attention, you're just not there tanking for your team, and you're losing out on a whole tank in the main fight. Even if your damage output's pretty high, the fact that there's not like a third wall or fourth wall in front of your team is kind of a detriment on the whole. But if you're running into double supports and you're really, really good and you're constantly killing those two support players, that's where you get your value as Widow, and that's why she's somewhat okay sometimes. Next up, we have Orisa, and honestly, she's debatably either a high S tier or low double S tier character, because she's just a really good answer to Hog, and honestly a lot of the characters that are, like basically all the tanks. Like, she's a pretty good answer to most tanks in the game, even including Zarya in open queue. Because, I don't know, having the stun is really useful, having her E for pushback is super useful, and especially where a lot of the time you're running 4 tanks and 1 healer, having Fortify for that self-sustain basically, and not dying as much, is absolutely massive. Because what happens in most open queue fights is it's basically whatever team loses like 2 people first, basically loses the entire fight. So not dying is a really, really big like value, and Orisa does that, and stuns people out of ults, stuns hogs out of hooks, can even spin to kind of like knock people off of a lot of the maps, or even just kind of put people out of position or push them into their team so they get like killed for being out of position. She's really good at punishing a lot of characters. You'll notice there's a lot of Orisa players toward the top of the leaderboard. I think there's actually an Orisa player in like it's still Orisa 1 trick, at like 2nd overall on the leaderboard, because she is just that good and that valuable of a character. The general comp that you run solo queue is generally Orisa, Diva, Hog, for that exact reason, because that core is really strong. But yeah, now on to the next character. So next up we have Baptiste. He's one of the most common solo heal picks. He has a lot of good group heal, his immort is super useful, but his damage, I mean, leaves a little bit to be desired. You don't really pick him for the damage. You actually generally, you know, in like role queue, you pick him for the mix of damage and healing, along with some utility. But in open queue, Bap is a solid high B tier, low A tier. I'll give him a low A tier. He's a pretty solid pick. That immort field is super useful for stuff like Grav, or Flux, or even like Diva Bombs if you really need it. And his healing output is pretty high, and his group healing is also really solid. He's just a really good healer. The one downside he has is kind of low mobility, so if they're running a dive comp into you, there's a good chance that you're the one getting picked out, because your team will be able to back up, but you kind of can't, so they'll have to play more defensive comp for Bap to work. But that's very possible to run an open queue. There's a lot of tanks you can run to make a defensive comp, and when you do that properly, the value Baptiste gets is kind of hard to match. Next up, we have Ashe. She's basically the same as McCree, but with slightly more mobility, so I'll put her a little bit higher in D tier, but she has the same issue of not doing enough damage. She does have the added benefit of Dynamite being able to hit like multiple targets, so I guess she has that, but in general, just the damage output you're doing and the loss of a tank is not worth going Ashe. Then we have Genji, and he's kind of similar to Widow, weirdly enough. You wouldn't think it, but his dive potential and the fact that there's so many dive characters in open queue meta makes him a little bit more bearable, and that puts him in C tier. I've seen a few solid Genji players manage to do some decent work. Not work that you couldn't have done with something like Winston instead, but still decent work. He's still somewhat playable, mainly against bad teams, which you'll actually find a lot of in open queue because a lot of people just don't use comms or don't work together a lot. So whenever that's the case, Genji can pretty easily dive the supports repeatedly, and it's kinda hard to stop him from doing his burst damage and kills when you're fighting two other tanks at the same time. Just kind of his annoyance is a really big factor in why he's like somewhat more valuable. But honestly, between him and Widow, I would still have a Widow, although I'd prefer not to have anything in C tier below in my team, because they're generally throw picks. Like, Genji generally gets ruled by, like, Winston, Diva, Hog, and, like, Sigma. So there's very little point in running him 99% of the time. Next up, we have Sojourn, and, you know, the big reason why I got really into open queue in Season 1 of Overwatch 2 is because Sojourn made role queue pretty much unplayable if you didn't play her. Now, luckily, in open queue, she is not that great. I'd say she's still a solid C tier, kind of the same value as Widow, but with a little bit of added mobility that makes her a bit more usable. Honestly, if you hit more of your shots and they're all headshots, you can kind of pick the support consistently, but either way, instead of having a Sojourn, you could just have another tank, and the value you get from one of those tanks is way, way better in general. You'd need to be an insanely good Sojourn up against a pretty bad team to have Sojourn get you a lot of value. Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about it. She's just like a more mobile Widow, honestly. Because she can charge a lot of railguns against like 3 or 4 tanks. It's just, she can't really get a lot of value out of them because she'll die before she gets them off. Next up we have Zarya, and she's a kind of interesting one because there's a pre-nerf Zarya where she had basically a 3rd bubble, and there's post-nerf Zarya where she just has 2 bubbles, like intended. And pre-nerf, she was honestly double S tier. Because Orisa and Diva were such good picks, Zarya was an even better pick because she answered both of them. And the sheer quantity of bubbles she had made her a really, really, really good answer to Hog. So you'll see a lot of the people in open queue play a lot of Zarya, and that's generally because they played her pre-patch, because that's where most of the people in top 500 did most of their playtime. But post-patch, Zarya is not as amazing. I'd say she's still a solid A tier. She doesn't counter Hog as much as the issue, but she can still definitely get you a lot of value. If you're a really good Zarya and you place your bubbles like perfectly, you can still get that same type of value you had before with the really high damage beam, absolutely shredding through Divas and Orisa players, and also stopping Hogs from getting free hook kills. But you need to focus a lot more on Zarya now and be a much better Zarya player to get a lot of that value. So honestly, I think she's more of an A tier pick here. Doesn't answer Hog or Diva or even Orisa's burst damage as much as she used to. Then we have Junkrat Queen, and I'd say she's just a B tier, like a low B tier pick. Out of all the tanks in the game, she's like the least tanky, and has like some of the lower damage outputs. What you can use her in, and what I generally see Junkrat Queen somewhat succeed in, is in quad tank. You use her as a temporary health boost and speed boost, like kind of like a budget Lucio without the loss of a tank. That's pretty much all the value I get out of her, though, is that Adrenaline Rush is useful if you can win team fights fast. But if your team isn't good enough to win team fights fast, which is pretty common in solo queue at least, she's kind of just a throw pick and doesn't do enough damage or tank enough to be on the same level as all the other tanks we talked about so far. Then we have Moira. I'd say she's a very solid high S tier pick. Like I kept mentioning, there's 3 tanks, 2 supports, or 4 tanks, 1 support. The team combo that generally wins more is 4 tanks, 1 support, but it requires a lot of coordination. But when you do have that coordination, you generally go with Moira as your healer pick because that group healing is absolutely insane. I've had several games where my single heal Moira has went into 30,000, 40,000, and even 50,000 healing in just one game. A lot of times without even reaching overtime or anything. She just does that much healing. You can be that much of a heal bot if your team just plays somewhat grouped as a set of 4 tanks. She also has some decent damage output that can kind of annoy the enemy supports with Damage Orb, and the ability to fade can be really nice to kind of get away from a Winston or Diva that's diving you real quick, and then you can point them out to your team and they'll get punished for being out of position. Overall, she's just an amazing support in this mode because of that group healing potential, and Coalescence is even better because there's just so many massive hitboxes all over the place that being able to hit like all of them at once is kind of a really good ult. Then we have Mercy, and honestly, she isn't completely awful. If you have like a decent Hog or something, she's okay, but generally against a good team, Mercy just dies repeatedly to Hog. But if you can stay alive on Mercy and you can get in some decent healing and damage boosts, although you're mainly doing healing in this mode because damage boosts don't help that much for most of the characters, if you can stay alive and you can get key reses, that's where you get your value as Mercy, because resing a whole tank is some insane value, and if you can play around that, you can kind of stay alive a lot longer than most other teams, even though your healing output's going to be a bit lower with Mercy. But in general, she's just not the best to have on the team. She doesn't do enough healing to be of value as a healer, and she doesn't boost your damage enough to give you the same value that like Zen has, where something will straight up die like instantly if you all dive him properly. So overall, she's like a very low C tier, right at the edge of a character you just never want to see on your team. Next up, we have Mei. And I'd say she's honestly a middle B tier pick. Mei is generally trash. Like 99% of the time, Mei's a pretty awful pick. Orisa fucks Mei over pretty hard. Hog can fuck over Mei pretty hard depending on how good you are at predicting those hooks. And I guess she does actually answer Diva pretty well. But the thing with Mei is if you can get those key Mei walls up at the right time, your team can absolutely capitalize on them, and I've won a lot of games by having a good Mei just use proper Mei walls and just get a free pick to win every given fight. Because in open queue, that first pick actually has a big impact. Like in roll queue, you can lose a person and you could very easily win that 4v5, especially if you have some ults left over. In open queue, if you lose a pick early and someone else on the other team isn't close to dying, 9 times out of 10 you're gonna win that fight just because you're like things die a lot slower in open queue, so having that pick is massive because the damage output of your team just got cut in like half. So for those Mei walls, she can be amazing, and on certain maps you can get them a lot easier than others. On like a lot more open maps like Junkrat, you're not gonna get a lot of value from a Mei, and she's kind of a throw pick. That's what I meant kind of where she's situational, but even then, like, unless the enemy team is playing out of position a lot, or your Mei's playing out of their mind, you'd much rather just have a tank over a Mei. Next up we have Hanzo, and honestly, I'd say he's kind of just a D tier, like a low D tier. Unlike Widow and Sojourn and Genji, who can kind of either dive the back line or like one-tap them from a decent distance away, Hanzo kind of struggles to get those longer range support picks because 9 times out of 10 he'll end up just hitting some random tank by mistake. And his ult doesn't do much unless you're comboing it with Grab, specifically. But just having a Hanzo specifically for that is not worth it. He doesn't do enough damage, like, quick enough, on average, to have the same value as most other tanks would just have instead. So generally, it's just someone you don't want to see in your team. Obviously, at a lower elo of open queue or something, I'm sure you can do fine, and you can hit enough headshots on the tank or something, you can still kill him. But in general, the tanks will just be a better pick for higher damage output and better ults on average. Then we have Kiriko. She's honestly the best support by a mile. Her ult it basically wins any fight you use it in. Like, if you use the Kiriko ult before everyone on your team dies and they don't have a Kiriko, you just win that fight. Like, there's nothing the enemy team can do to stop that insane speed, reload, like, damage output that you get. Her immort nades can be super useful, especially since a lot of time people do run Ana in open queue as one of those 2 supports in the 3 tank, 2 support comp. And being able to get rid of those anti-nades on your hog can be actually game-winning. But the main thing for her is that her ult literally guarantees that you win a fight. And she can actually be a solo healer in 1 support with 4 tanks. If your tanks are good enough, have enough self-sustain, like if you're running like Wrecking Ball, Roadhog, and like Orisa or something, and like maybe a Diva, she can heal enough that she can keep your team alive enough that they'll win the fight, and then she can heal them to full after the fight. But she's a lot like more of an interesting pick with 4 tanks. It requires a lot more skill management and a lot more team coordination to make sure that she can keep everyone alive. Unlike Moira, where generally you can kind of just stay as a cluster and Moira will just heal the fuck out of them. But she's really good because she's just good as the solo healer and the double healer. And the ults literally win you games and fights all the time. Like, there's nothing you can do to stop a Kiriko ult with like 4 tanks who have infinite cooldowns. It's just unstoppable. Next up we have Lucio, who is honestly a solid A tier pick. His speed is really good generally on push maps. If you're running double support, he generally should be the second one, especially on push maps, because having more fights gives you more opportunities to win those fights. And especially where things die so infrequently, the healing isn't as important on Lucio, especially if you can pick their backline on Lucio, that's insane value, but generally, you just run a Lucio in open queue to get those speed boosts, to get more engagements, and his beat can be pretty nice at countering a lot of the tank ults you'll see. It's a pretty good answer to Orisa ult, to Sigma, can be an answer to Primal and Grav, and especially Hog ult and stuff like Shatter, he can be pretty big use for. But not to the same degree as like Kiriko, just with her nade. Kiriko's nade single-handedly will save you from like Shatters and Hog ults and everything. Like, there's nothing it can't stop. For that reason, he's like a decent support. He's generally a pretty solid pick if you're running 2 supports, but he's not the reason that you're going to be winning any games. Next up is Reaper, who's hands down the best DPS in open queue, and as you know, with that, I'd say he's an A tier pick. He's basically a budget Roadhog with a bit more self-sustain, because with so many tanks around, he can get a lot of damage in and basically always stay up without a healer. The problem is that he dies to Roadhog in 1 shot, and is generally pretty easy to hook with Hog because there's so much pressure coming around from outside that you can kind of make him use his Wraith without him really wanting to, and then Hog just gets a free pick on him, and you have a player down, you win the fight. But if you can not get hooked by Roadhog, Reaper is a literal carry in every single lobby, every single elo. That's how I climbed most of the way to Masters, but just by playing Reaper, because all the Hogs up to that point weren't able to do the one-shot combo on me well, or I could easily predict their hooks or something, so I could actually just carry on Reaper. But he's very, very solid as a DPS. The problem is that he dies so fast to Hog that he kind of gets knocked down just like a whole tier and a half just for that. But if they're either not running a Roadhog, or if their Roadhog isn't the best, then honestly he's a very solid S tier pick, probably above Moira. Next up we have Ana. She's generally a solid second support. And I think I'm gonna readjust stuff. I kind of should not have put Lucio. I meant Lucio and Bap to be reversed. I don't know how I messed that up. But anyway, Ana, honestly just barely above Lucio. Sleep darts and antis can be game-winning for your teams. The problem with Ana, though, is she's a really easy target to dive. So if you want to kill the enemy Ana, there's very little stopping you from doing that other than her sleep darts and her antis and her team having a lot of coordination to stop that from happening. It's kind of hard to protect your Ana in this mode, though, with the sheer quantity of dive tanks you'll see on average. But if you do, she gives you a lot of value, mainly through those antis, but with the abundance of Kirikos around, a lot of that value is kind of lost. although it can be nice to get rid of that Kiriko nade early so you can get a lot more value from things like Shatter and stuff. And Nano is definitely a very useful ability, especially if you're running like a Reinhardt, or if you have a Orisa ult. They can be really massive game changers. Not as much as a Kiriko ult, which will guarantee to win you a fight, but it can get you pretty close. And with the other utility she has, she's definitely a pretty solid pick for that second support slot. But she does have a harder time being the single healer and quad tank. Next up, we have Soldier, and he's just a throw pick. There's never a time where Soldier's gonna be better than anything else here. He doesn't have the burst damage that the characters in D tier have, where they can maybe sometimes kill a support or something. He just has really slow damage. His visor doesn't really give him a lot of value. His healing is kind of pointless. Then he gets rolled by Hog, Diva, and like Orisa. There's literally never a time I can think of where Soldier would be a good idea to run. Then we have Junkrat, probably one of the more common DPS picks, and he can get decent value. Probably put him above Junker Queen in B tier. You can just create a lot of pressure with Junkrat, and because you can play so far back with him and just kind of spam out a choke or something, you oftentimes won't need a lot of the resources from your healers. You can do stuff like triple tank Junkrat healer, which is worse than just having 4 tanks, because, you know, Junkrat can still get dived and stuff, and he is still pretty squishy. But his damage output is also insanely high, and if the team around the Junkrat is playing well, that extra just pressure and damage he can add can be insane and can be really hard to contest if the other tanks are playing good, because you just can't dive him because you'll get wrecked by a Roadhog or Orisa or something if you try to do that. And then he'll still live and just keep spamming you on, doing tons of damage, so he can get you a lot of value. But he also does die really fast, which is why he's in B tier, and he doesn't have that same self-sustain that Reaper has, which is why Reaper is the better DPS. Next up, we have Symmetra. She does, like, decent damage, and her teleporters can be useful on some maps, like, occasionally. And, you know, so can her ult, like her big wall. But on average, like, Sim doesn't do enough damage and is way too squishy to get a lot of value. Unless you're playing into like a really bad team or something. But generally I'd put her at the highest in D tier because she'll have some value in some maps, generally with those teleporters, but also if you leave her unchecked, she can build up a really fast beam and start shredding your backline really easily. But generally, if you're even remotely good, you can kind of just focus her early in the fights and then easily win the 5v4 every single time. Then we have Tracer. And while she should have the same value as Genji, that loss of vertical mobility kind of makes her a lot less useful, and especially since she can't shoot through shields as well. Like if you have bubbles or Rhine shields by like your supports, she has a harder time going through them than like Genji does, at least in my opinion. Maybe I've just had a lot of bad Tracers, but I'll put her in D tier. She theoretically should have the same like low value as Genji, where her whole idea is just to pick the 1 or 2 supports in the enemy team and get value that way. But unlike, I don't know, for some reason I feel like she does it worse. She has less health, less vertical mobility is the main thing, and she doesn't have that dash to get in and out and the deflect to help get in and out a lot more and be a lot more of a nuisance. All she has is like those blinks to just be like a little bit annoying, but she does so little damage and gets killed by Hog like so much easier that I feel like she just isn't a great pick for this mode. But she still can get some value if played at a high level and you're constantly getting the supports. Next up, there's Ball. For 99% of people, Ball is a throw pick, but for that 0.01%, like the 5 good Ball players, they will carry games single-handedly. A lot of the answers to Ball is just high damage, you know, stuff like Sojourn, Hanzo, like Reaper. They generally will do a lot of damage to a Ball and force him out. A lot of the tanks will have high sustain and a decent amount of damage, but not enough to kill a Ball. And with the amount of health packs that just generally go unused in this mode, Ball can keep his sustain really high. Like, he can basically self-sustain without any healers and just kind of get a lot of value. The really good Balls in open queue basically are constantly harassing the enemy backline and making sure there's no healers anywhere on the map for your team to fight. And they will just win games that way, because if the enemy team has no healers, or if they're constantly having to deal with a ball, they can't do anything. But the problem is 90% of the balls you'll find in open queue are not that good, so they'll just kind of occasionally roll by the enemy team and not really annoy them that much. Like, they'll be like mildly annoying, but they won't actually ever kill anything, so they don't get any real value. Also, his mines can be an insane area of denial tool, which gives him a lot of value there as well, and obviously his stall potential is insane. There's a lot of games where I should have probably lost, but I had a ball on my team that stalled the point for like an extra 3 minutes just by rolling back and forth past it, and that will single-handedly win you a lot of your games. Yeah, he's a really good pick if you play him well, but if you don't, he is definitely kind of a hard throw. Next up is Roadhog. He's the quintessential pick for open queue. If you're not running a Roadhog, you better have a really good reason for doing so. He has insanely good self-sustain, his damage output's insane, and his potential to one-shot healers is the biggest value he has, or just tanks in general. Like, if you notice like an Orisa half health without Fortify, you can hook him in and just kill him. There's very little people can do to stop you on Hog. A lot of the meta is kind of built around him, right? Like, Ball kind of doesn't die to Hog. He's one of the few things that doesn't. That's why he's so good. Diva is like somewhat of an answer to Hog, and that defense matrix just being annoying is enough to make her pretty solid. Same for Sigma's left shift, and Orisa's general kit is basically built to counter Hog, and also a lot of the other tanks. But yeah, he's just insanely good. If you're not running a Hog, you're kind of just tossing your games. Next up, we have Reinhardt. I played him a lot myself, but honestly, I think he's just a low S tier pick. He's nice because he can hit through Diva's defense matrix. His shatters will be game-winning, and if they don't have a Kiriko, or if their Kiriko isn't using their nades well, shatters can be legitimately game-winning, because if they don't wake up from their shatter, by the time they start standing up, they should all be dead to your tanks. That's where you get most of your values, Ryan. Otherwise, you're mainly like shield botting and like kind of just charging shatter as much as you can, and also just kind of swinging around. He's really nice for just being able to kind of be on point and just swing hammers in like 360s and constantly be damaging people and annoying them. And he's also a really good nano target, so if you're running an Ana, it's a pretty good option. But yeah, I mean, most of his value comes from his shatters, and then otherwise he's just like decent, kind of like Sig, but the shatters can be insanely game-winning. Especially since a lot of the common picks like Orisa, Diva, Hog can't really stop you from shattering. Orisa kind of can, but the other two can't really stop you from shattering unless they like time like a hook well or something. So you can get a lot of value, especially if you can like shatter their Hog and then kill him. That normally wins any fight, or just any of their supports. Like if you kill their Kiriko somehow, you basically won the game. But yeah, Ryan's just basically, he's also good answers for Sig, so if they have a good Sig, he's a really good answer. Yeah, he's just a decent pick. Like, it's pretty hard to go wrong with him, but the stuff in the top tier, it's really hard to go wrong with, so that's kind of the reason these three are where they are. Then there's Pharah. He's honestly a D tier pick. A lot of people seem to think she's around this B tier, or possibly even A tier. Like, I've seen a lot of Pharahs. But the problem is, at her kind of effective damage range, like where she actually does the most damage, generally without a Mercy, because having both a Mercy and a Pharah is losing a lot of value for your team. But where her effective damage is, she can kind of get wrecked by Diva, she can kind of get hooked by Hog, just annoyed by Orisa, and kind of just poked, and she doesn't do enough damage to be worth sacrificing generally 2 slots for her. Speaking of that, Echo is the much better pick. I'd say she's honestly right below Reaper, if you play her well. Now, I can't play Echo for the life of me, but her beam and her ult give you a lot of value. Like, on tanks, what will happen is you get to around half health a lot of the time, but then you get healed up by your healers back to full. But with Echo's beam, when you're around that half health range, she can literally just instantly melt you, and she can actually play in an effective range that's a lot, like, kind of further or more annoying than Pharah can. And I've gotten rolled by Echoes a lot in open queue. She has a lot more maneuverability too, and unpredictable movement. It makes her harder to deal with on stuff like Hog. And if gone unchecked, Echo can absolutely shred an entire team of tanks pretty easily. Then we have Sombra, and Pre-nerf, I honestly didn't see her a lot, so I don't know what to say about that, but I imagine she'd be pretty solid. And post-nerf, I feel like she gets the same type of value. I feel like in the same way that Kiriko ults can win you entire fights, EMPs have the potential to do that. The problem is, like, you're gonna get EMP like every 4 fights, and during those like 3 or 4 fights probably, and during those other 2 fights, you're getting like no value on Sombra. Like, you might be hacking their Reinhardt or something, but you're literally down a tank, and you're not getting enough value to be worth picking. So I honestly say she's a throw pick unless there's a ball absolutely destroying your team and you don't know what to do, and even then she's not really the best option. So yeah, I just wouldn't really pick Sombra in open queue. Next up we have Brig, and she's an interesting one, because she has some survivability, but can also die pretty easily, but also is like a nice big AoE heal. And rally can be nice, like it needs, especially with tanks, like it's kind of hard to kill a rallied Brig. But on average, a lot of the Brig players I see are pretty awful. The few that are pretty good though, just do pretty alright. I'd say they get similar value to Junkrat though, like they're not like a carry pick, and they're not the best option for that slot. You'd much rather have a Kiriko, Moira, or like Ana or something. Generally, when I see a Brig, I either assume I'm about to lose, or I hope the enemy team's bad enough that we can win. But yeah, she gets some like decent value, enough to be above everything in C tier and below, and enough where I can kind of see why she might get picked, but she requires a lot of like coordination and specific team comps in a similar way to Junkrat does, and for that reason I think she's the bottom of B tier. Next up we have Torbjorn. Honestly, one of the better DPS as well. That turret will not die to a lot of tanks easily. Like, Reinhardt can't touch the turret. Ball will have to go out of his way to kill a turret. Diva can kill the turret, but like she'd waste some defense matrix and some of her valuable time on it. Hog can actually kill turrets, and Orisa can like slowly kill them. But generally, your turret won't die too often, and you're kind of like a budget Reaper in your damage, and you do have some good self-sustain in your, like, overclock, like, whenever you do your, like, whenever you turn, like, into lava and you get, like, an extra 100 health and shoot faster and stuff. And his Molten Core also is a really good ult. It's really good for zoning, like, denying space. Like, if you want people out of some corridor, want them off a cart, it's really hard to contest a Torb ulting one of those things. And he gets really good value otherwise, just a general annoyance. You have to divert a lot of attention to him, and he can be a carry pick if your team plays well, but similar to pretty much every other DPS, if you're playing well, like if you know what you're doing, a tank will always be a better pick, unfortunately, and it's just kind of how it is. But if you're gonna have a DPS, having Reaper, Echo, or Torb is way better than everything else by a mile. Then next up we have Doomfist, and I'd honestly say he's an S tier pick. The problem is with Doom, he's mostly map dependent because he needs places where knockback is useful and important, and it also is very dependent on the skill of the player. A lot of Dooms just kind of aimlessly walk around and punch stuff and don't really do anything. But I've had a lot of good Doomfist that will like consistently kill the backline or like punch people off a map or something, or just push them into a position where they don't want to be, where they'll go die to your Roadhog or something. He's a pretty useful tank in that light, but on average, your average Doom player is going to suck, and he's just a throw pick. But when you do get a good Doom on your team, he can do a lot of work. Not the same as anything in the SS tier, like that's the essential 5. If you're really good at the game, these are the exact 5 characters you run. Like, this is like the Overwatch League 98% pick rate, like, picks. If you're not as good though, like Moira, Ryan, Doom, Sig are like really good alternatives. And the stuff in A tier you can totally win with. They're not like complete throw picks, and in fact a lot of people in top 500 definitely do run stuff like Ana, Zarya, Bap is a decently common one, and like I said, Torbjorn and Reaper are pretty common too. I think there's like 1 or 2 Echo players. There's not that many, which is why I don't know too much about her. But the few that I've faced have always done really well against me, so I think she's a decent pick there. But yeah, that's it for the Season 1 Overwatch 2 Open Queue tier list. If you have any questions about why I put something where I did, I'm more than happy to explain it more in the comments, so please comment below if you disagree with something I said. I'd be very interested to have a discussion about it. And do keep in mind, this is Overwatch Season 1. Like, I believe there's a balance patch coming out for Season 2 that will change a lot of what I'm saying here. But during Season 1 and during my hundreds of games, this is kind of how I felt about all the characters. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.